two guests and any listeners as well to somewhat of a special edition of Polity Matters. We're dealing with some stuff after GA that is taking a little bit of break from the BCO and thinking about some founders and some churchmen that are worth highlighting. And one of the first that I thought of is somebody that ties together my two guests that I have today. So first, I have Mel Duncan. Do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
I'd be delighted to. Good to be with you today. I'm Mel Duncan. I'm a ruling elder at Second Presbyterian Church in Greenville and also the clerk of Calvary Presbytery.
And then I have another guest. Jason, you want to introduce yourself?
I can do that. I'm Jason Helopolous, senior pastor at University Reformed Church in East Lansing, Michigan. And Jared, we have known each other a long time now.
We have. We first met in Dallas, right?
Yeah, like 20 years ago? Something like that.
It's been a while, yeah.
It's been a long time, yeah.
And that was because, where did you do your internship?
I did my internship at Park Cities Presbyterian Church here in Dallas.
And that will be relevant, as we'll see a little bit later on, in that the two guests here have in common that they both had a lot of interactions with one of the first people we want to talk about for ministry and a churchman, and that is the pastor, Paul Settle. Both of you had interactions with him. People will probably know Paul Settle from questions in licensure and ordination exams of name founder, and sometimes Paul Settle's name will be that, and candidates credentials. Sometimes I'm trying to mouth that to people as they can think of Morton Smith, or they can think of the first moderator, but a lot of times Paul Settle doesn't necessarily fall off the lips. He was a part of Churchmen United, one of those groups that was instrumental in the founding. Some may know that he was the eighth moderator of the General Assembly, but kind of knowledge of him may be limited to that. And so I want to talk a little bit about his role as a founder, but also as a churchman and as a pastor today. And so both of you had interactions with him. And I thought maybe we could start just with answering that question. How did you know Paul Settle? What was his role at the time in terms of your interacting with his ministry? And you can go first with Mel, and maybe you can fill out anything that I missed in terms of his background and who he was.
Well, Jared, I knew Paul Settle as my boyhood pastor, who I made a profession of faith under. He was the man who taught me to love the Bible. He was the person who modeled and really showed me what expositional Bible teaching was. He was also, even as a young boy, I realized that he was a churchman. He was involved. He was a leader. He just cared deeply about the church. And so growing up under his ministry, I came to feel like I was a part of the meetings, the purposes, the conferences, the conventions he was a part of. He was the kind of person in the life of the church who brought people together. And he was a rare variable in the PCA because everyone loved and trusted Paul. Even in those early days, there were different parts of the family in the PCA. And Paul was someone who had the respect and even admiration of everyone. Paul Settle comes to Greenville to be a part of the PCA General Assembly that meets in Greenville. And while that General Assembly is going on, a pulpit committee from Second Pres is pursuing him to be our minister. And so after the long hours of assembly was over, elders and members of our church were meeting with Paul for him to come be a part of our church. And so he follows Gordon Reed as he's the 10th senior minister of Second Presbyterian Church. And Paul's ministry was characterized as someone who was a renowned and revered pulpit teacher. I like to say Paul Settle helped get Second Pres's head right. He was just a remarkable teacher. And he complemented that by just being a remarkable Christian man. So I look forward to being a part of this conversation with you about Paul, remembering Georgia Settle as well, his beloved wife. Paul was just a treasure to the PCA. I could go in a lot of different directions on this, but I was thinking as we were going to meet today, some things I wanted to say about Paul. Paul loved the Westminster Standards and the Confession of Faith. He loved to teach that to people. One of my most prized possessions is he gave me his Westminster Confession of Faith. Mm-hmm. And I just love his little notes in there about the confession.
He wrote a study guide for it too.
He did indeed write a study guide. And Paul was a churchman. Paul was an interesting combination of both a lion and a lamb. This is an analogy that my pastor has taught to me. There's certain kind of people who can pull that off. Paul Settle was able to do that. He was versatile in ministry. He was at small churches, big churches. He was at agencies and committees. But through it all, he was the same person. And then the last thing I want to talk about is he was an amazing basketball player. And I hope maybe we can circle back around to that, because he was an amazing basketball player. So I want to put that on the table. And Jason, why don't you run with that a little bit?
Well, I don't know about basketball. This is news to me.
Well, perhaps we should start there. He was a high school basketball phenom in the state of West Virginia.
Really?
And his senior year in high school, he is put on a church, or it's not a church, excuse me, an all-star state basketball team that has Jerry West on it and Hot Rod Hundley, two of the most famous NBA personalities. Yeah. And Paul could have played on a major college basketball level, but he had already had a sense of call in his life to be consecrated to ministry. And so he goes from West Virginia down to Greenville, South Carolina, and goes to Bob Jones University.
Wow.
And I have several memories of him playing basketball. One is before he resigned from ministry at Second to take up the call as the director of Ridge Haven Ministry, he called me one day and said, "Is your brother Ligon and John going to be home over the holidays?" And I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well, I would like to play a 2-on-2 basketball game." And so me and Paul Settle took on Ligon, John Duncan.
Please tell me you beat him.
You better believe it. At least that's the way I remember it, Jason. But just like his theology, he was classic. It was like watching something out of the 50s. You know, he had good form, perfect technique, and he could hold his own. He didn't play dirty, I'll say that. But he was just, in every way, he was a man in full. Loved Paul Settle.
I think he played with Jerry West. I think Jerry West is
he's the logo.
He's the logo.
He's the logo, yeah.
Can you imagine? Paul Settle could have been the NBA logo.
There you go, Jason. Wouldn't that have been something? We should have put that as our PCA logo. As Paul Settle holding the basketball.
That would work.
Yeah. If you ever look at this picture when he was coming into the 8th General Assembly, he was an interesting dresser too. He had the plaid jacket on.
His grandfather owned a haberdashery concern in Charleston, West Virginia. Huh. And Paul was known for being a snappy dresser. And that picture captures the cataclysm of fashion in that era. I think is probably the best way to put it. Yeah. But he was a well-groomed man. He always looked really good, and but he was something.
That's excellent.
So that was from I think 76 to 91. He
right,
was
he said second. That's right.
Yeah, he did some other things. He was at one of the first directors, I think, of Christian Ed in the PCA.
He was the first director.
He was the first, and his wife founds women's ministry in the PCA, right. The Women in the Church Ministry. Paul had worked at Coral Ridge with D. James Kennedy.
Trinity Presbyterian.
The historic Trinity in Montgomery. Yeah. And of course, towards the end of his ministry is when y'all get to know him at Park Cities, a flagship church in Texas. And through it all, Paul is quietly discipling men. He's teaching the standards to officers and sometimes other staff members. And then he had this heart for men going into ministry. Yes, wherever he went, he always had a group of young men. I remember at Second, there was a group of a dozen post-college students. And everywhere he went, I heard there were groups like this, where he was having them over for dinner, taking them out to eat, but talking to them about theology and the need to pursue God's call in ministry. And that was true at Second. One of my brother Ligon's favorite pictures is that group when he was in college age in Greenville, that he was part of a group of men Paul was cultivating to pursue ministry. And it was because of that just about every PCA agency or committee at one point or another tried to get Paul to be their entity head, because he just got it. Paul got, he understood the tension between local church ministry and the need to plug into the bigger church as well.
Yeah.
Well, and I think a few other things to add. I mean, he was, not only did he lead Presbyterian Churchmen United, he was the chairman of the steering committee that starts the PCA. When he is, the eighth moderator of the PCA at that eighth General Assembly, to me, in many ways, that models what Paul was in so many ways, and that here he is, he's a moderator of the General Assembly, he was a trusted voice, he's a leader, and yet by everybody's account, every single person that walked the microphone, he called them by name.
Yeah.
I mean, he just knew the PCA, and he knew people, and he was a leader at the highest level in the denomination. When the PCA, even before it was beginning, as he is leading Presbyterian Churchmen United, I mean, he's going to presbyteries and to churches and meeting with all kinds of sessions and meeting with entire presbyteries and walking them through many of the errors that are happening in the PCUS and leading them through a lot of these discussions.
It actually goes back before the PCA. Paul was part of a group of seminary students at Old Columbia Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. And I've heard about this from different people. Morton Smith has told me about this group. Mr. Settle has told me about this group. But in the late 50s and 60s, there were conservative students at Old Columbia Seminary that were part of this discussion that the old denomination was fading theologically, and Paul was part of a group of Columbia Seminary students. D. James Kennedy was part of that group, that they would meet and pray and talk about the need to reform the church. And
more PCA founding pastors were graduates of Columbia
than
any
other institution. A lot of people don't know that, and so that group really, for the next generation, holds together and is a part of every PCA reforming impulse that's out there. Yeah, Paul is going around visiting churches. He's working with PCA future founders. He's involved in writing and ministry. It's remarkable. I mean, Jason, it kind of reminds me of you. It's remarkable how many different things he's doing all at the same time. And Paul held that tension of life and ministry together. But I gotta say, I think each of us will have a memory of Paul. He was just a very kind person.
Very.
And you had a sense, it was like you're talking to your grandfather, that you could just sit down with him and say, I just don't understand this. And he could explain it to you, and he just made sense of God's word, but also of the world to you.
Agreed.
So, did you know all of that when you met Paul Settle? How did you meet Paul Settle, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I only allow this out of the box. Jared and I share something in common that we kind of keep under wraps and try and not bring into the public view. But for the sake of the podcast, Jared, I feel like we probably should. But we are graduates of Dallas Theological Seminary. Yes. And while I was in Dallas, I was at Dallas Theological Seminary, and Paul was at that time associate pastor at Park Cities Presbyterian. And he used to do a Westminster Confession of Faith study group for DTS students.
Wow.
And so we would show up at his house on a Saturday morning, I don't know, maybe 7 a.m., 6:30 a.m., I can't remember, but Georgia would cook us a big breakfast. And then we would sit around and study the confession together. And, it was just incredibly impactful. I can remember a Saturday morning where there are 2 other DTS students, so there's 3 of us. Ed Clowney's in for a visit, so he's staying with the Settles.
Wow.
And so it's Paul Settle, Ed Clowney, 3 DTS students walking through Romans 9 together.
Wow.
And it was incredibly formidable times. And, I have no clue at the time who Paul Settle is, or I just know that he's an older man, he's a pastor, and he's willing to spend time with us. And he was a man that was not only kind, but he didn't have errors.
Yeah.
I mean, he humbly spent time with these 20-something-year-olds that knew nothing. I knew nothing about the confession, and grew incredibly over those years sitting with him.
We're recording this at a conference right now, and one of the talks at the conference was about a famous seminary professor who was rather imperial when he taught. You never got that with Paul Sutton.
Never.
You kind of wanted to be familiar with him because he made you so comfortable. I had that same kind of experience with Paul towards the end of his life. I went to him and said, when you were my pastor, I really was a boy, and I would love to study the confession with you. So the last few years of his life, we would meet once a week and just study the confession.
Oh, I love it.
And it was just fun to talk to him about those things. And he had taught it so many times; he was really good at it.
He was great at it. So I had that benefit, and then RTS. So at the time, Westminster Dallas was starting there at Park Cities.
Right.
And so, though I'd been through the confession a couple of times with Paul at this point, and we'd gone through some books together, he and Sinclair were teaching the confession together as a class. And so I said, can I please audit that? Yeah, so I sat in on that class and listened to two of them go back and forth on the confession, which was just a wonderful time. But, the humility of him, one of the stories, it's just, at the time I didn't think a lot of it, but since I've been a pastor, it just sits on my mind a lot. He sits on my shoulder a lot, Paul does. There are different people that sit on my shoulder. He's one of them. Yeah. There was a time I can remember, one of those Saturday mornings, I asked some question about about prayer, and was asking Reverend Settle, I don't understand, how do I know that my prayers are tainted. How are they, acceptable before God? And then I also asked a question on baptism, and was trying to sort through covenantal baptism at the time. And I don't know what his answers were. What I remember is, and this is back in the time of answering machines, is that later that week, there's a message on my answering machine when I come home to my apartment. And it's Reverend Settle. And he says, and that he had that voice, he said, Jason, I've been thinking about how I answered your questions on Saturday, and they weren't sufficient. And he left a 5-minute message on my answering machine, answering the questions. He said, I needed more time to think about it. Here's how I would answer you now. So, an older pastor, you get this young whippersnapper seminarian, you've given him an answer, you move on. He had so many people to pastor at a huge church like Park Cities, and yet he took the time to say, that wasn't good enough. I need to get something better. Just very thoughtful. Yeah.
So what would you say then that you learned from him, either as a mark of, some people have marks of grace and holiness on them that you see, that you say, I want to image that too, kind of imitating me as I imitate Christ type things, or lessons that you just learned from him as a churchman or as a pastor, things that you carry with you, anything else that you would want to put your finger on in that mold?
So I think a couple that we've touched on. One, I always think about him, and that he reminds me of old Princeton, is what he reminds me of, or did, is that he was willing to stand up for truth. He was willing to fight the good fight of faith, and he was willing to say hard things, and he did that in the course of his ministry, fighting for truth. And yet he was always a gentleman, and I've always appreciated that about Reverend Settle. The other is the humility tied to that. He was just a shepherd, and he truly loved people. And then A couple of other things stick out in my mind about him is that one, he was such a churchman, and he believed in laboring in the courts of the church, and he labored hard in them, but he didn't do so to the neglect of the pastorate that he was in. And that's being a faithful Presbyterian in my mind. If you're a pastor, you labor hard in the courts of the church because we're Presbyterian, but you don't forsake your local church. And Reverend Settle did that well. One of the things that I remember thinking, again, young guy, thought more highly of myself than I should have. And I can remember sitting in some of his Sunday school classes at Park Cities and thinking, some of these things are antiquated that he's doing. Because what he would do, he was teaching seniors, and he would pass out tests. And he'd have them take tests. And I just thought, this is nuts. I mean, this is antiquated. What are you doing? And it was brilliant, and it was good. Because he was so concerned about Christian discipleship and education, and hence why he was the first, chairman of CDM, what at that time was CEMP. But he was willing to challenge people even in their 70s and 80s as he's pastoring them at Park Cities. I'm going to teach you, and then we get to the end of this, I'm testing you. And I loved that about him.
That's so good, Jason. I guess what I would add to that is you could always count on Paul Settle not only saying the right thing, but in the right way. And throughout his life, he had to say hard things at different times. And when not to go back to basketball again, but just like there are certain players you can just count on. You can count on Paul Settle in a certain situation. And so it was not unusual that Paul would be asked to moderate not only Presbytery meetings that would be sensitive, but General Assemblies. After he moderated in the late 70s, he would frequently be asked to moderate General Assemblies in the 1980s because they just knew Paul would do a good job. And sometimes if there was a moderator that just needed to step away, Paul would be the one who would come in and moderate a meeting. Paul would say truthful things in hard ways, or hard ways in truthful but effective ways. I remember as a teenager, I asked him to write a reference for me. And he gave me a good reference, but it was a hard reference. And I remember reading that like a baseball player reads the scouting report going, how did he know that about me? And it's because he knew me. And it hurt when I first read that reference, but I treasured that because I realized my pastor really knows some areas of my life that I need to do better in. Paul was, he was just utterly without guile, and I don't mean to make him into the perfect man, but he was one of the best men that I ever met in my life.
I agree.
Yeah, I actually only knew really Paul Settle by reputation, except for meeting him once, if you remember when you brought him to Twin Lakes one year. But I knew him by reputation through people at Park Cities. They were affected by his ministry.
Yes. And
one of the things I kept on hearing about was the way that he was not only a pastor, but he was a good husband. And especially at the end of his life, or at the end of the life of his first wife. So I wonder if you both could tell a little bit about that story about his first wife and his role, not just as a pastor and churchman, but as a husband.
I'd be happy to start that. I've been privileged to know both the first and the second Mrs. Paul Settle. Dear ladies, Georgia Brown Settle was just a godly woman and pastor's wife. I can remember as a young boy sitting on her couch and talking to her about my problems, and she had a sympathizing tear and also made good pancakes for me too, Jason. She developed Alzheimer's and Paul was the model of a caring husband for her. I think that occurred kind of later in his time in Dallas, and Paul realized that the right thing to do would be to bring her back home to Greenville, and so he ended his life in ministry back in Greenville where he had pastored, and Georgia came home. He had some family in the area, and so it was just logical for him to do that. But I remember both visiting the Suttles in Dallas, but also being with them in Greenville, how he was just the picture of a faithful, godly husband caring for a person who no longer really remembered him. And it was astonishing how I had seen him in kind of almost in a superhero way, as you kind of view your boyhood pastor, just watching him as a faithful husband caring for someone suffering from Alzheimer's. And he did an amazing job with that.
Yeah, it was amazing to watch in Dallas, even as you saw her start to decline. And there were some of those mornings that we would get together, and she was already suffering some, and he would help to compensate for her, and yet they kept doing ministry together as long as they could in that kind of way, just investing in others. And that's even to go before that. You think about Reverend Settle. He has a huge impact on the PCA. Georgia has an incredible impact upon women in the PCA, and for decades, and will play a key role in women in the church. In the PCA will play a key role with many of the women's ministries that will develop out of CEP. And Paul encouraged her in that regard and really set her free to use her gifts, and she became a trusted voice with women in the PCA.
And it's really true. I mean, a lot of even women's leaders today are like the grandchildren of Georgia Settle. Paul was, by God's grace, he ended well. He was a good father to David and to Lynn, and a good husband to Georgia. Later, after Georgia goes to be with the Lord, he marries Mary Aiken Russell, who is a dear widow at Second Presbyterian Church, and they had a fruitful marriage in their latter years. And then the Lord calls Paul home, and Paul was at the end of his life was the men's ministry coordinator at Second Pres. He had done so much. I mean, in addition to his pulpit ministry and his church ministry, he had been active on different boards that served the broader church. He was real active at Westminster Seminary. Paul was a part of the board that kind of helps in the resurgence that's been going on at Westminster Seminary in recent years. Loved Westminster Seminary. He had worked for the Presbyterian Guardian, for World Magazine. He had just done a lot of different things. And
Greenville Seminary.
He's really the first entity head of Greenville Seminary. He was just really a very fruitful minister. And through it all, he had a lot of wonderful pastoral relationships. I was here that year he came to Twin Lakes Fellowship, and that was a special memory as well to have him here. What a life well lived. I would say to you, if you're looking for signs of Paul Settle, if you're listening to this podcast and you're trying to connect with the PCA, you'll see Paul in the gentlemanly comity that we think of with the PCA. Robert's rules, lightly followed, always courteous, but pointed, like good debate is at two points of the sword. You'll see that in the friendly polity of the PCA. You'll also see a man who knew his theology, who knew history, and who would faithfully tell you what the letter of the law was. I think about Paul as a churchman. There are times where we have to say the hard things to one another. Paul would say the hard things, and his whole ministry, he had to say hard things, but he said it in such a way that you were drawn to what he was saying, not in a way of dividing, but okay, Paul's trying to bring the church together.
Yeah, I kind of noticed that in his 25th anniversary, because he wrote a history of the PCA, kind of coffee table type book.
Right.
And he had some concerns about the PCA that you could tell if they came out through it, though it wasn't, hit you over the head with it.
Yeah.
But one of them was partisanship.
Yeah.
What do you think he would say about the PCA today? I mean, he saw the PCA well past its founding.
Yeah.
Did he have any concerns about whether it be the way that we debate or partisanship or any other things? What were some of his concerns about the PCA after the founding of the direction that he was seeing it going?
I've had some of these conversations. You may have had some too, Jason. How would you answer that?
Well, I would say he was concerned about different things that were happening in the PCA. I remember having some of those conversations with him, and he was always willing to press into those and have the conversations, and yet he always wanted to speak as a way that people they disagreed with would speak for themselves if they were in that conversation. One of the conversations that most sticks in my head that I had with Reverend So, we were at an IHOP. I can remember where we were at, and I can see us sitting in the booth.
Is this in Dallas?
In Dallas, at an IHOP, having breakfast, and it was the Federal Vision Days, and I'm getting ready to come into the PCA, and there is all kinds of debate, and the PPLN had just done some things as well, and I'm looking at the landscape and going, there's a lot of conflict. And I remember saying to Reverend Settle, how soon do you think the PCA is going to split? And is this really worth devoting my life to this denomination, kind of going in? When's it going to split? And remember him again, that deep voice he had. He said, Jason, he said, as long as there are, and he said somebody's name, as long as there are men like this, I'm not worried. And I look back to that, and I've told this story before, but I remember when he said that, I thought, that's absolute nonsense. Like, you're putting your trust in men. And I thought, he doesn't know what he's talking about. All these years later, I look back and I think, I know he's right in that men follow men. Yeah. And in many ways, Paul experienced that because men followed him. And he knew that, look, if you have some of these men of character and some of these men that are willing to stand strong when it's needed and willing to be gracious and long-suffering when it's needed and know and have wisdom when to weigh in, when to be patient, you can keep these things together, but not only keep them together, but it can grow in faithfulness over time. And Paul, to me, is an example of that. And many of these founding fathers of the PCA are examples to me of that. And that's one of the ways that he sits on my shoulder. And I just think about some of those conversations we had, and even in that moment, what he was, in essence, advised me, saying, look, Jason, that there are men like this. And it was also kind of a little nudge to me, Jason, be a man like that, as he set that person before me.
Do you allow Lord of the Rings analogies on this podcast?
It is allowed. Yes.
Since he brought this up, I think this will be apt. There's a wonderful moment in the story of the Lord of the Rings where a famous battle has occurred and a famous city is lying and there are no gates. The gates have been knocked out. And there's a discussion about what do we do, because we need to go back out to war, but we have a city without gates. And one of the characters says to another character, men are better than gates. And what we're talking about is someone who was a man who was better than a gate. And that's what Paul Settle was about. Paul knew, because Paul had to put it all on the line with other founding father godly men. And there came to be an esprit de corps and a trust amongst those men. And then you find this as you're a churchman, maybe you're listening to this podcast 10 years from now and you feel like you're all alone because you're having to make an argument that no one wants to hear, but it's the right argument to make. And you'll find in people like Paul Settle, you learn how to make a persuasive, godly argument over and over again, and you become a man who is the gate for the institution. And that's what Paul Settle was. Paul lived a full life. He loved the church. He went wherever he was asked to go, and he made a compelling biblical argument, and then he trusted in the Lord. And then others of us came along, and we saw Paul, and we've tried to be like him in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it speaks volumes. And you have the By Faith article when he passed away, just of the different people from, you may identify them from different camps that all had something good to say, and were affected by him and the way that he conducted himself, which may lead to kind of a final reflection. If there are especially some people will listen to this podcast to get ready for their BCO exams, and so they stumble on this, and they're a young elder or pastor getting started. What's their takeaways? What can they learn? Because you had extensive interactions with him. I knew him by reputation and met him once. These are others will never meet him. What actually can they take away and say, here's a lesson in a young officer or pastor's starting off, either from his life or character or ministry? What's something that they can take away from Paul Settle's ministry and life?
Well, I think it's what I would say is what you do on your podcast every time, is that there are principles that are really more important than the actual, color by dots that we sometimes approach with our polity. Is learn the principles of church government. Learn about ministering and declaring. Learn about joint and several. Learn about the big ideas that unite the church together, and then apply them fairly to the situation. That's what Paul was. I mean, a good churchman is a good umpire in a baseball game, and you come to trust their judgment as they apply the rules fairly.
That's good. Got to add to it. Paul believed the church was worth laboring for, and she was worth loving and expending yourself for, and she is, because Christ died for her. And so think about him. I only knew him as an old man, but when he started a lot of these labors in a greater way within the PCOS, he's a very young man. And you take a lot of these men, he and D. James and Kendi Smart and a lot of these guys, they looked up to someone like a Nelson Bell, and they respected him, and they were willing to follow him, and yet they were also men that labored hard in their own respect, and were willing to put their shoulder to the plow because the church was worth it. And so I think that was a good balance a lot of those guys had, where they were willing to respect the men that were older than them, that they believed were principled and holding on to things well. And they were also willing to throw in their weight and labor hard. And so I'd say that to a young man. Is don't let them look down on you because of your youth, and yet also be willing to give a listening ear to these older men that you respect and believe are chasing after Christ hard.
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts or things you want to get in before we wrap up?
I'm thinking of a conversation I had with him when he was coming under care, and I want to say it was the Presbytery of Orange. Now, I don't know what his first call would have been, but it would have been in North Carolina or Virginia somewhere.
In West Virginia.
Is it West Virginia? Okay. So, I want to say it's a Chapel Hill area, because I think the Presbytery of Orange is around. Am I right on that, or am I wrong on that? Because I know he grows up in West Virginia, but he's at his first Presbyterian meeting coming under care, and he's, young Paul Settle, full of love and truth, and he's asked about the virgin birth. And someone says to him, "Do you believe in the virgin birth?" And Paul, this is the PCUS in the 1950s and 60s. He says, "Yes, I do." And he says someone laughed in the Presbyterian meeting. And another person gets up and says, "Why on earth would we vote for someone who would believe that Jesus was actually born of a virgin. And he said to me, he said, it was kind of a good preparation for what he was going to do in his life, which is be involved with starting a new church. And he said to me, he said, I've often thought about, that person who was mocking, they were mocking me. They were mocking me out of their own conviction, but their conviction was wrong. And I said to him, well, how did you respond to that? And he said, I told the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I told the truth.
Love it.
And that's Paul Settle to me.
Yeah. Love it.
Yeah.
Everything else?
Well, the other thing maybe we haven't mentioned that was true of him was he was a pastor of pastors. It was no mistake that, as the first I ever heard of, that maybe there were others in the PCA, but when I was in North Texas, he enters into retirement, but the way he enters into retirement is they make him pastor at large of the presbytery.
Yeah, I remember that.
In effect, bishop of the presbytery, and but it fit him so well in that he always invested in pastors, and he was not going to stop doing ministry, though he's still caring for Georgia, and he's retired. He was going to be pastor at large and still help younger pastors sort through things, and that's how I will always think of Reverend Settle, because he shaped me greatly in that way, and a lot of his wisdom and really just his model of ministry has impacted my entire life.
Well, thank you two very much for sharing some of your memories and thoughts about Paul Settle. Hopefully it will make him more of an answer when people are asked, name a couple of founders of the PCA in their exams. But again, thank you for your time, Mel, Jason, and
thank you, Jared.
Thank you,
Appreciate
Jared.
what you do.
Very thankful for you.